I'm asking myself, why are we not talking about how we get to that decision? What's that journey to recognizing that children aren't in your future?
Yeah.
And that messy middle ground is something that I saw was so overlooked. There were relatively few resources, support. And I really just started talking about it out of interest. And I felt like it was a story to share about how I got clarity, how I made this decision.
Hey, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Bold Women in Business podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Honeyman, founder of Honeybee Bold and fellow bold woman in business. This show is all about highlighting women who are changing the world, helping other women, and kicking ass along the way. Let's dive in. I am so excited to welcome Keltie Maguire onto the show today. Keltie and I have been connected for a while, so it's great to finally get to connect with you on the podcast. You're doing just incredible work that is so necessary, but it's something that I think most people don't really think about or don't take the time to think about. Keltie helps women navigate the often harrowing decision of whether or not to have kids. She and I actually connected because her business is called Kids Are Child Free. Is that
Correct,
right?
Yeah.
And I've talked about this openly. I'll probably talk about it more on the podcast at some point, but I am actually childless, not by choice, after a long journey with infertility. And so that's kind of another side of this whole like decision between having kids, not having kids. Sometimes that decision is made for us. And so that was how we initially connected. But the work that you're doing is just so powerful. And I think that so many women really struggle with that decision. And even though many, many people take it for granted.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you describe the work that you do a little bit. Tell our listeners, what does this look like? How do you help people make these types of decisions?
Yeah. Well, thank you first of all for having me on and for such a lovely introduction. You know, it's really interesting because for me, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about like business entrepreneur stuff today, but it's really been a journey getting to what is, I don't want to call it like a niche business. It's niche in the sense that there's not many people who do this work. And it's not niche in the sense that arguably this is a decision that most people will need to consider at some point in their lives. A lot of people don't appreciate or recognize it's a decision. As you mentioned, a lot of people take for granted that they can or can't have kids or that they do or don't want kids. But yeah, I have been helping people get clarity and direction in different areas of their business and lives for several years now. And like many businesses, you know, it sort of started with my own being at a crossroads. What do I want? What's next for me? I had relocated from Vancouver, Canada to Munich, Germany 6 years ago. And found myself questioning whether the product-based business I was running at that time was still for me. I was designing jewelry. There was a lot of initial passion and some of which was enough to sustain me, but I ultimately came to the decision to close that business. And A, trying to get clear on that decision, and B, figuring out what was next and how to come to terms. When we think about grieving certain things in our life and closing doors, we often think about, you know, relationships, or maybe, for example, a loss of not having. And actually, I'm sure probably you can relate in this. I think a lot of people might not think about a dream of having a child or children as the kind of loss that we as society recognize. But a business is another one of those things that when we say this is no longer for me, or oftentimes this didn't work the way I hoped it to, or it didn't look the way I want, it can be really challenging. So through that own process of getting clarity on things and asking myself, how do I want to support other people? I saw that there was a through line with a lot of the entrepreneurs and business owners that I talked to, that there was a real lack of clarity, not just in terms of what it was they were creating and doing, but what their drivers were. And not just this idea of, you know, I want to have a 6-figure business and I want to be on XYZ blog or podcast, which are great goals to have, by the way, but really figuring out like, why is this important to me and how does this connect to my broader life? So I'd been doing that work for a few years. And alongside that came to another crossroads and sort of a crisis of faith of like, what do I want when it comes to having kids or staying child free? And like many women, I had the assumption that I would probably have kids someday, but it always felt like not today and probably not tomorrow either. And I'm 42 years old now, but I met my now husband when I had just turned 27. And he very much seemed like the kind of person I would want to have kids with. You know, I immediately envisioned a long-term future with us. And yet I kept postponing and putting off the decision. And he also had ambivalence, probably less so than myself. I think he would have been, let's say, happy 50-50. I felt very ashamed that I didn't have what I felt was a desire I should have to have kids. And I was really struggling to contend with the idea that I could have a good, happy life without them, because everything I'd seen is that's what people do. And so recognizing that a lot of the work I was doing with my clients around career and profession could be applied to this work. And then B, going through and navigating that myself and coming to the conclusion that I did, in fact, want to stay child free. I realized that lo and behold, there's so many other people who are struggling with this decision. And
Yeah.
it's becoming a little bit more talked about. And we see quite a bit more in popular sort of mainstream media discussions around being child free by choice, how we view women who make those decisions, women without kids in general. Of course, we look at what's happening right now in your home country, the US, and commentary with, I don't want to even say the name JD Vance because he's all across my news feeds. And I'm kind of tired of hearing about it. But like the notion of being a woman without kids, whether that's by choice or circumstance, there's lots of important discussions happening and lots of ridiculous discussions happening. And yet I'm like asking myself, to go back to, former me having recently decided not to have kids, why are we not talking about how we get there, how we get to that decision? Or, in your case, I'm sure it's very similar. What's that journey to recognizing that children aren't in your future?
Yeah.
And that messy middle ground is something that I saw was so overlooked. There were relatively few resources, support. And I really just started talking about it out of interest. And I felt like it was a story to share about how I got clarity, how I made this decision. And I had the opportunity to be on a large podcast in the space called We Are Child Free and to be featured to their community. I was probably, I want to say, the first person who really talked about this ambivalence and indecision around this. And in effect, sharing my decision and the anxiety I felt around making it, I had an outpouring of people reaching out saying, I relate so much to what you're sharing. I also feel stuck. I also feel like there's something wrong with me because I don't just know, as we're told that we should and we will. And so, long story short, effectively, I've now become intentional about doing work in this space. To answer your question of how does that look, I had reservations because I felt like this is too big of a question for me to ever be able to help anybody with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, and this is a good thing I realized. I don't know what people should do. I have no answers for you if you're struggling with this question, but I do have questions and exercises and a process that I've developed that can help people and that is proving to help people really connect with what it is they want for themselves, what feels right for them. So it takes the form of one-on-one coaching. I offer workshops. I offer group programs. I have a podcast. I have an online, Instagram community, loud traffic. And through all of that, helping people get closer to or help them make the decision that feels best for them.
That's incredible. There's so much in what you just said that I want to touch on, but
Yeah.
I think you talked about how do women come to this decision, right? How do we actually make these decisions and how do we think through it? And you mentioned this kind of shame that's often attached to coming to these decisions. And I think the other side of it is not just what happens leading up to it, but then also the aftermath, right?
Big time.
And that's something that I've really been thinking a lot about the last couple of years since I've been kind of in this new state. I think that on a societal level, we are told that womanhood and femininity looks a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And when it doesn't look that way, whether that's by choice or not, that's something that we have to navigate and say, okay, what does it mean to be a strong, powerful, self-assured woman in this world, in this society, and thinking about how we set goals and dreams and aspirations in this kind of state of our womanhood not looking the way that society tells us it should look, right? And so I'd love to hear, when people are coming to you, what are those fears, aspirations, desires? What is it that they're looking for when they come to you, besides for obviously finding clarity, but what's kind of underneath that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And interestingly, I think what's underneath their fears, it's in many cases the same on both sides of the decision. So I see, for example, like a desire for connection is really big. That's like an innate human desire. At least, most of us, we want to feel connected. We want to feel loved. We want to be in community. We want to be a part of things. And so, for women who are considering the child-free path, are heavily leaning that direction, or ultimately choose that, there's this fear of, will I be other, in the fact that if I don't do what everyone else I know or everyone else I seem to know is doing, what's that going to mean for me and my role in my friendship group and my family and society and at work? Am I going to be alone or lonely? The aging piece is really big, especially with a child-free decision, because we have historically had very few examples and role models of women who have aged without kids. And like, what does that look like from a practical standpoint? What does that look like emotionally? A lot of women really align or feel that their highest purpose will be found in having a child or children. And while I appreciate that is the case for some women, certainly it's not the case for all moms. And for women who choose not to have kids, this can be a really difficult sort of like pain point, because they feel like they have to do something else, like in place of having kids. And sometimes they, maybe you want to do something instead. It's not just like, we can think about our lives as like life, and then you can add on, we can call it the icing on top, depending how you look at it, as having kids. But the cake itself, we can have our own icing as child-free women. Yeah. We cannot even eat cake. We can do something totally different. So figuring out what's meaning to me, what's fulfillment to me. I always say to people, if you're questioning whether it's enough to not have kids, ask yourself, is that coming from the outside, i.e. somebody's telling you you need to have something extra, or is it your own drive? Because it may be that you realize work and or relationships and or hobbies, maybe there is a missing piece where it comes to something that really fulfills you or excites you or brings some element of passion to your life, whatever it is you're after. But I just think we need to be mindful that if we want to do something again instead or extra or on top, that it's coming from us. It's not because we feel like we have to.
Yeah. And I think that, and tell me if this is something that your clients have expressed to you, but I feel like there's a reason that probably the majority, although you probably know the numbers better than I do, like of how many women are choosing motherhood versus not. I assume that we're still statistically where most women do choose the path of motherhood.
Yeah. Right now I would say, I guess we're like, what we call it ourselves millennials. I always lose track because there's like these new terms coming out all the time, but I think we're still,
I think we're both solidly millennials. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm solidly millennial. I feel like I'm on no, maybe I am.
Maybe cusp. I don't know.
Maybe on the cusp. Actually, you know what they call me? How old are you, Rachel?
I'm turning 37.
Okay.
So I think we're both solidly.
I'm 42 and I feel like I'm like what they call an elder millennial, which I'm like, whatever. Elders are amazing, but you have to kind of chuckle. It's like, I'm an old millennial. So, God, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question, please? Just the tail point.
I was just asking, and it was actually just a tiny tangent of what I was going to say, but percentage-wise, how many women are choosing this path?
So most polls and studies and surveys are showing, and this applies to many of the world's countries, at least, westernized or developed, which of course I'm using those terms very broadly here and carefully. Probably about 20 to 25% of people, and I it's not vastly different between genders, will not end up having children either through choice or circumstance. So it's quite substantial. It's like 1 in 5 people will not have kids or doesn't have kids. Of course, depending on your age, it could be even higher, but to call it like for women, the post-menopausal years, it's quite high. And yet, to your point, still most women do have kids.
Yeah. And so women have this innate drive to nurture, and that often, I think, in most cases translates into motherhood. But for many, many women, that can translate into many other things, right? So for me personally, I think I probably would have always, whether I became a mother or not, I would have eventually started a business. But once that decision was made that we were not going to continue down that path, the drive to nurture a business became so much stronger because I have this innate drive to nurture. And I think that nurturing it can show up in so many ways, right? Whether that's nurturing your community, your friendships, your pets, if you have pets, if you love plants, whatever that is, or you become a business owner, there are so many ways to bring that to life without necessarily taking that path that the majority of women take. You can take another path and still invest in that drive.
I agree. And I think, first of all, if there's people listening who don't identify with that and they're like, I don't feel like I have this nurturing side. I think in ascribing that to women, I don't want to disagree, but I also want to say a lot of that is very much socialized from a very young age. And that's which isn't to say it's not innate, but it's like innate from birth or innate because from birth we're shown how to be a certain way.
Sure.
There's apparently also very interesting studies that have been done showing that when men take a primary parental role, that they actually show and release and have like similar, I guess, hormones and emotional experiences and exhibit very similar nurturing tendencies. And we even see this apparently amongst like the animal kingdom, like seahorses, I think are an example of like men taking on that role. So yeah, so it's interesting. That being said, I very much agree with you. And I think if anything, it could be a chance for us to nurture in a way that is perhaps like a little bit more well suited to other traits that we have, other needs that we have, other desires for our life. And I'll give you a funny example that came up in one of my podcast conversations recently. And I had a guest on named Amanda E. White, who runs an account therapy for women. And she was saying that she looked at her relationship with her dog and she said, basically my dog's a pain in the butt and it, has all these medical conditions and has behavioral issues. But she said, my husband and I, we just love this dog to death. And I thought, if this dog can bring me so much joy and fulfillment and meaning and nurturing, then I think a child could potentially bring even more so of that. And what I said to her, as I said, that's really interesting because I see my dog in hindsight having played a similar role in a sense in my nurturing, call it maternal or lack of maternal journey, if you will.
Yeah.
But the result was totally different because what I saw with my dog is my dog sort of like satiated some of my need to like maybe care for something, to create or grow family between my partner and I. And yet it was enough that it made me say, I don't want more of this. If this is what having a dog is, I don't necessarily want to have human children because this gives me enough of what I want and need, but it shows me also maybe where that boundary is for me, where I'm sure I think I probably have capacity to be a great mom, and I'm sure I could have found fulfillment in it as well. But it's just interesting for me. I do think that my dog was that nurturing piece, but also, like I say, when I talk about for you, you may be better adapted to or suited to nurture a business or to nurture a broader community or to nurture family ties or to nurture yourself, like to really cultivate relationship with self. So I think we have to kind of flip this idea on its head that we have to find like a replacement baby, if you will, that it's like, it may look like something totally different, but I agree that urge that, again, we all have to connect, to be part of community, to love, which is probably even underneath the nurturing, I think can be founded in so many different ways.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Obviously, these are generalizations, but I think the key is that it's about finding the path that feels fulfilling and right for you.
Totally.
And I think that's so important. And bringing it back to the entrepreneurial side, I think this is something that I talk about with my clients all the time because I'm all about connecting with what's underneath your brand, right?
Yes.
What's underneath the reason that you want to start this business or nurture this business, and what's the real reason behind it. And then that allows us to build a very values-driven business. And that's not going to look the same for everyone. And it shouldn't look the same for everyone. Yeah. Everyone is going to be building the business that is a direct reflection of their inner values and what drives them. So I think that those are very linked ideas, is that it's all about finding the path that is right for you.
100%.
Not just listening to what, someone else tells you externally.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think, the form in which that drive or desire takes is going to be different for all of us. But fundamentally, it's getting to the root of what is that? What do I ultimately want? Why am I? And for people who are even very clear that they do want kids or they don't, to really be clear on like, what are their reasons for that? And to also look to other areas of life or business or family to not have, and this is probably also a good parallel with business, to not feel like that, the case of kids or in the case of business, that it fulfills all those needs, because there can be different vehicles.
Sure. Yeah. So we all have our reasons for starting a business, as we talked about, right? Everyone has their reasons. Yeah. What lights you up the most about your business? And has that changed since you started? Yeah,
such a good question. I would say doing the work with my clients lights me up the most. I mean, when I facilitate and host these conversations, first of all, with my workshop, which is it's a couple-hour workshop. For most people, it's the first time they've ever really talked about these feelings of ambivalence, of loneliness, of feeling shame that they don't have a clear decision, or they don't have, so-called maternal feelings. That is just so magical to see people enter what is, I hope, to be a very safe, supportive space, and to have them start to get insights and also to see their decision in a different way. And the same goes with my programs and my one-on-one coaching, is that we tend to get really, when we're stuck, we kind of tread the same path over and over and over again. And to see somebody like form a new pathway in their mind or their heart to say, oh, here's a different approach. Here's a different way of looking at this. Here's a different way of understanding what's going on. It's so incredible. This question about, do I want to have kids or not? Well, very important. Of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest decision we make. All of my work, I really believe, and including my support of business owners and professionals, which I still do, it's underneath this overarching idea that I want to help people be intentional with their lives and deliberate with their lives in terms of really, life is short, life is fragile. They're platitudes we all know, but to really say, for me, how can I ensure that I am being conscious about the life I'm living, about the business I'm growing, about the decision I'm making, and not just to operate on autopilot, but again, to really have that intentionality for me is something really powerful. And it feels like a gift that it's super rewarding for me. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that my next question was
Yeah.
actually going to be like, what is your superpower when it comes to helping your clients navigate such a difficult, sensitive, personal
Yeah.
decision? What makes you the perfect person
Yeah.
to help them through this?
I think it's a few things. I was going to say I have lots of superpowers. And, it's really interesting because you kind of asked me what's changed from the beginning. And I feel like I had great aptitudes, when I was a jewelry designer, doing the broader clarity coaching, as I call it, to now focusing more specifically on this kids or child-free decision. But I really see it as like, it's like a sharpening or a honing where it's like I'm getting closer and closer to really allowing all of those gifts and talents that I've cultivated as well over time to shine through. I think, first of all, the fact that I know what it's like to be on the fence and to feel stuck. And while many of my clients will choose motherhood, and of course that's not my personal identity, one of mother, I am one of who can probably be very few people in their lives who is totally uninvested and unbiased in terms of the decision they make, who truly deeply believes, and my clients tell me this shows through in the work that I do, and even how I show up online, that both are equally valid, very beautiful, very fulfilling decisions. And I frankly think that most people could probably be happy and cultivate a great life either way. So there's a lot of freedom there for people to realize, hey, I can be okay either way. And this person gets it. While I don't have answers, I'm also very open in sharing and talking about my own experience. And to your point, once we make the decision, it's not like the work is done on either side of the decision. Then it's about stepping into a new identity and really cultivating a life and saying, what do I actually want this to be and to look like? And so I also can help people with that piece as well in terms of, especially being child-free, because people coming to me, they're like, well, I was child-free before, but there's something different about having a definitive decision made and then envisioning what the rest of your life might, or what you hope it will look like.
I have seen the way that you approach this on your social media. I think that you really do such a great job of validating both choices.
Yeah.
I've seen a couple of other accounts that kind of pushing towards one direction or the other.
Yeah.
The way that you approach this feels very validating and freeing for many women who are just like, I really, really am ambivalent and I really don't know how to navigate this. And both decisions feel equally okay or not okay to me. And I think that must be a very, very valuable thing to experience. One of the questions that I love to ask is about core identity pillars as a brand. The way that you have built your brand, and I think you have a very strong brand presence and all of that. As you've built this business as a coach, as a speaker, as a podcaster, right? You're doing so many things. What are those like core identity pillars that drive you? People tend to think of these as values, but I think this goes kind of a layer deeper. Like what words come to mind when you think about that?
It's so overused, but I have to say it, and that is authenticity. And this is probably another one of the reasons I really love this business is to contrast it with when I was a jewelry designer. I definitely felt like there was, in some sense, I never felt like I was maybe like cool enough or polished enough or like this vision of what you might think of like someone in the fashion world. That's not just had to do with that business. That's just like a personal journey that one needs to go through. But I feel like I can really, truly show up as myself. And when people meet me, and it's really interesting because I'll sometimes leave people little voice notes who like have listened to my podcast and they message me and I respond. They're like, oh my God, it's so crazy because I hear you on the podcast and you sound just like you. And people meet me and they're like, I think there's a level of like coherence, if that makes sense, or consistency across who I am as a person and how that shows up in my business. Certainly the honesty, but like humor as well. I would say I'm a little bit cheeky and sassy, and I like to kind of poke fun at myself and at this dilemma. People resonate with a lot of my memes that I share because it kind of laughs at like these cultural norms of like, we should know by the time we're 35 and the biological clock is ringing. And so I think that relatability piece is also really big. I never want to position myself as someone who's like on a pedestal and I'm a guru who knows all. Of course, I want my brand, I want my podcast to sound good. I want my Instagram feed to look as good as the next person, I'm sure. But that's not what's most important. For me, it's about being a real person. And then I think, sort of like feeling safe and supported, like not being judgmental. I really want everyone, all women, all folks, all genders, all backgrounds, like to feel like they can feel seen. And so for me, I'm always very conscious. I work with a lot of women who don't have partners, or I work with women who are in same-sex partnerships, and to feel like everyone can be here and be a part of this. There's, of course, unique challenges and struggles that are faced, but at the same time, there's a lot of feeling seen, I think, in what I create and what I speak to.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. What do you think is the hardest part of running a business as a woman? And what do you think is the best?
Oh, gosh. It's funny because I usually don't care if I get questions beforehand, but I could have given some thought to this. One of the hardest parts, I think partly is the way that a lot of us women have been socialized, which is, let's say, first of all, there tends to be, and this comes across also in the way I help people to get clear on what they want, putting other people above ourselves. And there's something beautiful about selflessness and acts of service and being loving and supportive. But I think a lot of us have lost connection with what we want and what's right for us. And I think that's probably a challenge for business owners everywhere, but really being able to attune ourselves to, does this feel right to me? Is this the way I want to operate? Is this how I want to price my offers? Whatever it may be. I think one of the challenges is really learning to listen to ourselves, not feeling like someone else knows better than us and deferring to the powers that be on the internet or the other coach. And that's also been a huge journey for me, is to like pay less attention to what other people are doing and really recognize that I'm not replicable because I'm me. And unless you're Keltie, like it's something very unique. So I would say that's one of the biggest challenges. Probably the best thing. There's so many wonderful things. I suppose I feel really empowered. Yes, there have been generations of women. I mean, first of all, as mentioned earlier, all types of work and contribution are valid. And certainly being a stay-at-home mom is not any bit inferior to being a business owner. But I think for me, going out and creating something in this world, having independence, having a voice, being heard, being helpful, being able to do it on a broad scale, that's something that women haven't had for very long. I feel very empowered and moved by the rise of women in business, in music, in art. And it's not that we've ever lacked those things, but I feel like we finally, perhaps through social media, probably, we have a voice that people are very clearly trying, mostly men, white men, all those capitalists we hate, that they are trying to suppress. And it feels beautiful to be part of what I feel and what I try and cultivate in my surroundings is a supportive network or broader community of women who are all out there trying to forge their way forward, trying to be of service to others, trying to build beautiful lives. So it feels very empowering.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's obviously a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world, and certainly women are affected by that in ways that we could probably talk for hours about that. But at the same time, we are living in a pretty incredible time. As women, to be able to form community, as you mentioned earlier. Like, I think that there's this strong sense of community within the female entrepreneurship world. And we're really empowered to take charge and make our voices heard and develop our voices and support each other. So it is a pretty incredible side of this. One question, which some people have a hard time answering. We'll see if you do or not, but
I can do it. I can do hard things.
Money, you can do hard things. You can answer it, but I don't know if this will be one that you're like, oh, I wish I had gotten this beforehand. If you had all the money in the world, money were no object, what would you be doing differently, if anything, in your business?
I think it would be interesting to think about having the money to potentially amplify what I'm doing. Would that take the form of paid ads? For example, I'd love to be able to hire a really high quality podcast agency that helps secure interviews for talent. There are actually very few that do a great job. And I know because I get crappy pitches all the time for people who are totally inappropriate for one of my now defunct podcasts that I never had guests on. But like, to have somebody, it's not that I don't like doing that work, but I feel like, as as business owners, we only have capacity for so much. And we also I was in sales for a long time, and we could argue pitching sort of PR opportunities is not unlike that, but it would be wonderful to have somebody who could look out for and help pitch me for great opportunities in my business to be on, various big podcasts, which PS, if you have a podcast you're listening, feel free to reach out. Yeah. And to even think about, I think for me, to put together a really savvy ad strategy, for example, to get people in top of funnel with some of my free resources or my affordably priced workshop, it would be neat. I think it would be like just really help magnify efforts, because they say the right point to do that is when things are going well. And I feel like I have a lot of really good systems in place and I'm doing good work. But of course, it takes time to get your voice out there. And the only reason I have reluctance is I also feel like things are unfolding at the pace and in the way that I think is going to be most supportive for me, and also in the way I can best handle it. So yeah, I guess, but if I had unlimited money, I'd be like, sure, like why not get some support with X, Y, or Z? Yeah.
Exactly. I love that. Every time I ask this question and the answer is something along the lines of, I would be doing more of what I'm already doing, like that's always like the best, because it just means you're doing what you love, which is great. Yeah. Where can people find you? How can people work with you?
Yeah. Well, everything will be found under kids or child free. So as in, do I want to have kids or stay child free? My website is kidsorchildfree.com. I have the same handle on Instagram, which is the main social platform you'll find me on. And I would say, check out my podcast, the Kids Are Child Free podcast. In that podcast, I have conversations with both women with and without kids. I've had a few men on recently, really looking at how they made their own decisions and also some of the expertise that they have in their respective fields. And I also have lots of great free resources on the website. And for those people who are interested in getting more concrete support and to work together, I would say either my workshop would be a great option, which I host usually once or twice a month. It's a couple of hours, and it's a really good way to get a sense of the work that I do to start to make some more traction with your decision. And conversely, people are welcome to book a free call to talk about what one-on-one support might look like via the website, kidsorchildfree.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was so great, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel.
All right, beautiful humans, that's it for today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Bold Women in Business podcast, hosted by yours truly, Rachel Honeyman, with music by Shmukalele. This show is brought to you by my company, Honey Be Bold, where we build bold, unstoppable brands and websites for kick-ass women in business. If you are a female entrepreneur or dream of being one, and you want to take your business to a level that no one can resist, reach out to me at hey@honeybebold.com for a free vibe check. Honey, be bold. See you next time.